I was born in September 1922 in Rochester, New Hampshire, lived there for the first 10 years of my life, lived for the next 22 years of my life in Lynn, Massachusetts, except for service overseas. I moved to New York City, where I lived until July of 1983. And since that time, except for a period of incarceration, I have been a resident of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I attended university a couple of times during the course before the war, or at the beginning of the war and after it, and then had a career in management consulting, which lasted until about 1972, tapered off, sort of. My most notable professional achievement was developed during the years 1948, 1952, in certain discoveries of a fundamental scientific nature in respect to economics. And my professional qualifications are essentially derived from that. In the course of time, in 1964 approximately, I was persuaded that things were being done to change the United States, which, from my view, were the worst possible disaster which could befall this nation. And thus, while I had given up any hope of political improvement of this country before then to speak of, I felt I had to do something. So I became involved part-time from 1966 through 1973 in teaching a one-semester course in economics, largely on the graduate level at a number of campus locations, chiefly in New York City, but also in Pennsylvania. In the course of this, a number of the students who participated in these classes became associated with me. And out of this association came the birth of a nascent political organization, as much a philosophical organization as political. Our essential commitment was third world issues and related issues. That is, that the economic justice for what is called the third world is essential for a just society for all nations. I became particularly attached to this during military service overseas in India, where I saw what colonialism does to people. And I was persuaded at the time, as I believe a majority of the people who were in service with me, was that we were coming to the end of a war which we had not foreseen, for which we had been obliged to fight, and that if we allowed these circumstances to prevail that I saw in the third world, we would bring upon ourselves some kind of disaster, either war or something comparable down the line. And that was essentially our commitment as an association. We became rather unpopular with a number of institutions, including McGeorge Bundy's Ford Foundation. About 1969, we made a mess of a few projects he was funding by exposing them. And we also became unpopular with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, perhaps on the behest of McGeorge Bundy. In 1973, there was, according to a document later issued under the Freedom of Information Act by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the New York office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, acting at all times under supervision of Washington headquarters, hatched a plot to have me eliminated or to induce the Communist Party USA that my elimination would solve a number of their problems. There actually was an abortive attempt on me during that period. And later, of course, I knew the FBI had been involved. I couldn't prove it then, but I knew it. And later, a document appeared showing that. From that point on, during the 1970s, until the end of COINTELPRO, we were constantly beset by the FBI. Our main weapon against the FBI was jokes. We used to make some jokes about the FBI, which we would pass around to try to persuade them to keep off our tail, but they kept coming, and all kinds of harassment. The motivations of the case against us, I think, are in part obvious, perhaps partly not. In 1982-83, there were two things which greatly excited my enemies. Number one, I had been involved in 1982 in presenting a proposal which is based on my forecast in the spring of 1982 that a major debt crisis would break out in South America, Central America, and the expectation that Mexico would be the nation that would have a debt crisis. I've been involved with many of these countries and personalities in them in projecting alternatives to this kind of inequitable system where colonial nation had been replaced as a term by debtor nation. And the debt of South America, Central America, was largely illegitimate, that it was a debt which had not been incurred for value received, but had been done under special monetary conditions under the so-called floating exchange rate system, where bankers would come to a country, the IMF in particular, and say, we just wrote down the value of the currency, we're now going to refund your financing of your foreign debt, which you can no longer pay on the same basis as before. So I propose that the debt crisis be used as the occasion for united action by a number of governments of South and Central American countries to force a reform in the international debt relations and to force a reform within international monetary relations. This report was entitled Operation Juarez, largely because of the relationship of President Lincoln to Mexico during the time that Lincoln was president, with the idea that it was in the interest of the United States to accept and to sponsor such a reform, to assist these countries in the freedom to resume development of the type which they had desired. And this report was published in August of 1982, ironically a few weeks before the eruption of the great Mexico debt crisis of '82, and was presented also to the U.S. government, the National Security Council, for the president's information at that time. There was some effort on the part of the president of Mexico to implement my proposal in the initial period of the debt crisis. He had at that time some support from the president of Brazil and the government of Argentina. But under pressure from the United States, the government of Brazil and Argentina capitulated, and President Jose Lopez Portillo, the president of Mexico, was left, shall we say, hanging out to dry. As a result, in October of 1982, he capitulated to the terms which were delivered to his government and people around him by people such as Henry A. Kissinger, who made a trip to Mexico at that time to attempt to intimidate the Mexicans to submitting to these new terms. This was one issue between me and Kissinger and his friends. The second issue was that sometime about December of 1981, a representative of the U.S. government approached me and had asked me if I would be willing to set up an exploratory back-channel discussion with the Soviet government, because the Soviet government wanted, according to them, an additional channel to discuss things. And I said didn't reject the idea. I said, but I have an idea on this question of nuclear missile. It was becoming increasingly dangerous, forward basing, more precise missiles, electromagnetic pulse. We're getting toward a first strike. It would be very useful to discuss what I proposed in my 1980 election campaign with the Soviet government to see if they'd be interested in discussing such a proposal. This might prove a profitable exploratory discussion. And so from February of 1983, or 82 through February 1982, I did conduct such back-channel discussions with representatives of the Soviet government in Washington, D.C. Those were somewhat fruitful, but ultimately abortive. Kissinger and others became aware of this discussion during the summer of 1982, and their circles were very much opposed to that. The general view was expressed, but that I was getting too big for my britches, and I had to be dealt with on the question of debt, which some of these people were concerned about, and on this question of strategic missile defense, which I had this proposal which the president adopted, at least initially, in the form of what became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. And when the Strategic Defense Initiative was announced by the president on March 23rd, 1983, there were a lot of people out for my scalp. Those are the at least contributing factors in what happened to me. But they may not be all. There probably are others as well.